Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Training Tidbits podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Cartledge from Animal Training Academy, and I'm extremely excited about having you here with us today and being back in your eardrums to talk all about best practice behavior management for what is set to be another amazing episode. I can't wait to dive in and learn all about today's guests and their learning odyssey. If you haven't checked the past episodes out yet, then make sure to head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and you can listen to them all there. Or you can also find them on iTunes and/or on Stitcher. There is definitely something there for absolutely everyone, as well as some sensational up-and-coming episodes planned over the next wee while. Just before we do get started, though, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone that listens to this podcast on a regular basis. Or maybe you're joining us for the first time ever. This show is so much fun to make, and I get inspired thinking about all the people that have benefited from all the wisdom our podcast guests have shared. Today's episode is, of course, going to be no exception to this. And if you do like the episode today, then please share it as far and as wide as you possibly can. I appreciate that a lot of you listen to the podcasts from apps on your mobile devices and smartphones. And one really easy thing you could do that'd be really appreciated is navigate to the title of the podcast. And around there somewhere, you should find three little dots. If you tap on this, it will open up a menu. And one option in that menu is to share. So you can really easily share this on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever social media network you might use. I would be extremely grateful if you took a couple of seconds to do that. But we will get started on today's episode where I'm going to be talking to Kirstin Anderson Hansen. Kirstin is currently a postdoc at the University of Southern Denmark and in cooperation with the University of Veterinary Medicine Hanover, where she trains grey seals and aquatic birds, currently cormorants and penguins, to investigate the effects of underwater noise on marine life. She started her career at the University of California in Santa Cruz over 25 years ago, working with cetaceans as a research assistant and trainer. Later, she followed some of the dolphins to the Shed Aquarium in Chicago, where she worked and trained Pacific white-sided dolphins, beluga whales, harbour seals, sea otters, and penguins. In 1998, she was offered a trainer position at the Fjord and Belt in Denmark, training harbour porpoises and harbour seals for research and public demonstrations. From 2003 to 2013, she was the training coordinator and zoological curator at Odense Zoo, where she had the opportunity to expand her training experience to all types of animals, including lions, tigers, giraffes, tapirs, birds, and manatees. Kirstin is the co-chair for the training committee at the Danish Association for Zoos and Aquariums, as well as the assistant chair for the animal training working group at the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums, where she is also an instructor for the animal training and management courses for both the DASA and the ESA groups. In Amata, she is the regional report coordinator as well. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome one Kirstin Anderson Hansen to the show today. Kirstin, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to be on your show, podcast.
It's an honor, Kirstin. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day today. So thank you very much to you as well.
Thank you.
We're going to dive straight into the first question today, Kirstin. Could you please take us back to where you first learned about positive reinforcement animal training and some of the first animals you ever trained using it?
Where I first learned about positive reinforcement training was in Santa Cruz at the University of California at the Marine Lab, where I was working as a volunteer. I started watching behaviors for a research project, and I had the night shift from midnight to 4 a.m. But then I started to get involved with a project that was right parallel to this with Pacific white-sided dolphins. And these dolphins had recently come in from the wild and were going to Shed Aquarium in Chicago. And I started helping by washing buckets and just sitting and watching the trainers and seeing this amazing communication that was happening, and started asking a lot of questions, and was very fortunate enough to work along Lisa Takaki and Ken Ramirez. And at that point, had no idea who I was working next to, and learning exactly how all of positive reinforcement works, and became very addicted to it, to really basically after I finished my degree, wanted to go on as a trainer more than as a biologist, because I wanted to be able to work hands-on and see how does someone really develop this kind of communication with animals.
So your first position was a research assistant. So you kind of started your career observing animals.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
And do you think that was important? Those I've had other guests say that they started by just observing animals, and it's a thing that a lot of people potentially could benefit from doing more of. What do you think you learned from that period of sitting in the late shift, just observing?
I think anyone who really loves animals, the thing is you just love watching them, right? You love watching how they react and act in different situations. And that, of course, is something that as we become more involved in our jobs with animals, you get less and less time doing, but it's what you want actually more and more time doing. But I think for me, it was just watching the animals and watching actually that relationship and communication between the animal and the trainer. That was, how is that working? And when you first see it, you see it as a type of magic. And then you start to realize and you start to learn about it and find out that there's actually real science behind it. And it's an incredible thing to see still to this day. One of the most favorite thing that I love is breaking that communication barrier with a brand new animal that has never been trained before. And when they finally realize that they can communicate back to the trainer as to what they want to do or not want to do, that's that great moment.
Yeah, well articulated. And you got to learn about this stuff and you got to observe this communication happening between animal and human at Shed Aquarium. Is that where you really first started to learn about this stuff and you're watching Ken Ramirez?
Actually, it was in California. It was there. I was there for a couple of years. Everybody starts by just washing buckets and cleaning pools and sorting fish. And then you get a chance to maybe feed an animal every once in a while and then see how the behaviors are developed. And then I was lucky enough when the animals moved to Shed Aquarium to be able to follow them. And then that's when I was actually hired for the first time as a paid position, working as an animal trainer and working with Ken. So I was very fortunate that basically the first 6-7 years of my training experience was with Ken Ramirez. Yes.
That's fantastic. Can you share any stories from your early days? Maybe one of your favorite animals you trained?
I mean, definitely, I think one of the favorite animals was just the first animal you ever trained. And still to this day, it was a Pacific white-sided dolphin. Her name was Cree. And she will always be special to me because when they look at you and you realize that they're looking back at you and you have to earn their respect. And when you finally hit that point where you've earned their respect and they're willing to work with you, it's an awe-inspiring moment, right? It really does take your breath away. And you never forget it.
Yeah, great way of putting it. When the animal looks at you and it's waiting for that next piece of communication.
Right. And it says, okay, you're good enough. I'll work with you. You've now been approved. Then you think, oh my God, here is this amazing animal that's willing to spend time with me and teach me a few things or two, right?
Yeah, definitely. Hey, wonderful. And I love hearing about people's behavior odyssey. So thank you very much for sharing that.
You're very welcome.
Moving forward, I'd really like to talk about some of your current endeavors. Now, something we didn't mention in your bio there was that you actually have your own animal behavior consulting business. Is that correct?
Oh, I do. It's more of a hobby that if I get approached, it's still usually in zoos or aquariums that I love to be able to go and help any problem behaviors.
So you're more involved in doing this for some of the organizations in Europe. We mentioned EASA and DASA. Have I said that correctly?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what your involvement there is and about those organizations?
Yes, of course. Yeah, that starts about 18 years ago where I started. It was the first time I ever worked at a zoo. I had been working at marine parks for my entire life and started working in a zoo and I was very shocked by the way that these animals were being managed. That basically animals that had any kind of behavior problem were just put down or moved to a different zoo. Anytime an animal needed any kind of medical attention, it was darted and knocked down. And any kind of management problems, the animals were punished. They were still using fire hoses with water to move animals and shift the animals. And coming from a positive reinforcement background, I was shocked and could not understand that this is how these animals were being managed. So I immediately was really kind of pushed by the thought that we need to teach these keepers a better way of doing this. So I designed an education for zookeepers, and it was also for curators and vets as well, but it was really designed for zookeepers to have a better understanding of how their behavior affects the animals and how easily they can adjust their behavior to encourage animals for desired behavior. We were able to get permission through the Danish AZA to create a zookeeper education, and that became a very big success. US, where then I was together with a colleague of mine from Copenhagen Zoo, where we then went on to the European AZA, EASA, and started to argue that we need to really get this kind of information out on a European level. And that was supported. And we were able to come up with the animal training working group through EASA, as well as the animal training and management course through the EASA Academy. And that has now been running. This is the 6th year that the course has been running.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what the course entails? And for those listening in Europe, where they can go to find out more information and potentially attend some of these events. I know you've got one coming up in the next week or two, don't you?
Yes, next week we will be in Zagreb in Croatia at Zagreb Zoo, where we will be having the course. And this is the first time the course will be in Eastern Europe. So we're very excited. And anyone interested can actually just go into the EASA Academy. Just Google EASA, EAZA Academy, and look for this course. And it is a 4-day course. It's a very intense course because, of course, as we know, there's a lot to animal behavior. So it's a very intense course over 4 days, where there is a lot of theory, and then as well as theory, there is a lot of hands-on practical. So when you leave, you have the theory on one hand, but you've also tried and worked through a lot of these principles with either mice or rats or gerbils.
And unfortunately, I just realized by the time we release this episode, we'll be getting feedback from you about how Croatia was.
Yes. Yeah.
But we can check in on that website to find out information about future events, can't we?
Yes, we can. Yeah. And it's usually offered every year in mid-October. We try and keep it at the same time every year.
So I'm going to deviate just off topic a little bit, but just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this difference you found when you got into your new role with a more diverse group of taxa, and you found that there was scope for injection of some new information and some new ideas. Do you think that this was a difference in the mindset of people looking after different taxa, marine versus other vertebrates? Or was there also, did you find a difference between regions of the world? I know you're heavily involved in the European region at the moment. Was there a different culture there when you got there compared to America?
Yeah, there was a very different culture. And I think it seemed to be at that point about 10 years behind where America was in zoo animal management. And since then, in the last 10 years, it's of course come all the way up to meeting and matching North America's standards, which is really great and wonderful to see. But it was at that point very shocking for me to see the standards that were. And at least now we know that it's really progressing in the right direction, and there is a real wish for it to continue that. The other issue was it wasn't necessarily the keepers or the management wanting to use the techniques that they had. It was just that those were the techniques they knew of, and they didn't really know any better. And as soon as they realized how easy it was to do it the other way, then it became very, very exciting. And I think that's what shows how fast this whole trend of positive behavioral management moved through Europe, is how excited everybody was to have a better way of doing it. Because really, to be a zookeeper is not an easy job. It's a very, very hard job, and you don't make a lot of money. So you only do it because you love it, and you do it because you love the animals. So then if you can find a better way of taking care of the animals, you're going to do it.
So did you have any challenges, or was it all?
Oh, there was definitely resistance. Yeah. You definitely have old school versus new school. This is the way we've always done it. This is a waste of time. And you have still a lot of that. Oh, we don't want to train because we don't want to tame the animals. We don't want to make a circus out of this. So in the beginning, actually, we couldn't even use the word training, because immediately the word training meant that you were doing something from a circus. So we would use the word teach, or we would use the word enrichment. That was an okay word to use. And basically the way it worked was making very small successes by teaching basically a coati to go into a box to be able to be weighed without having to be drugged to be weighed. Them finding out actually that animals were a lot more active during the day instead of sleeping all the time. The other keepers started to notice this and realize that there maybe was a benefit, but there were definitely some hard years.
Yeah, really interesting points. And unfortunately, I still know keepers in positions in zoos in regions where this information is readily available, where words like circus are being thrown back at them.
Yeah.
You had some great little tidbits there that potentially we can influence more people if we change our language.
Yes.
And we get small successes. Anything else you want to add in there, not just for zookeepers who might be in an organization that they find challenging because they're getting all of this information and it's above where their organization is, but also just for anyone training any animals, dogs, for example,
Yeah.
and the similar experiences they might have when trying to pass this information on to other dog trainers.
Yes, and I mean, I think if we take the zoo world first, and I know there are places that basically they have to hide that they're training. If they're training, they have to hide it from other keepers. They have to hide it from management. And that is basically if you can prove through some small success, that you were able to voluntarily weigh an animal or voluntarily crate an animal for transport. These are these small successes where suddenly you're saving time, you're saving the animal stress, and you're saving the other keepers time. So these very small successes can start to change and make things go your way. One other thing we did was we actually did a survey in the zoo about training, because there were also this whole theory of there are certain animals that are acceptable to be trained, like for example, sea lions, but tapirs, for example, why should we waste time training a tapir? So we did a survey with the guests where we asked questions to the guests that saw a training session with the sea lions versus a training session with the tapir, and realized that they found out that in the end, it was actually for training was for the animal's well-being. They learned a lot more about the tapir. They became a lot more interested, and then they actually found out a lot about the conservation efforts that were happening. So in that way, by doing this small research project, we were actually able to win the management side of being able to get permission to train. And that's one way to do it, is to do these little things that actually proving that through training, you can have the guests stay longer, which means more money in the end. And then these small successes help to convince maybe the other generation of keepers that it's actually a better process. That's what we learned in zoos. With regards to dogs, I really think it's just a question of if you didn't have that leash and all you had was yourself, would your dog still be choosing you over something else? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the lead takes away choice.
Right. This choice and control, right? So I guess for dog trainers, I have a lot of people that say, yes, we use positive reinforcement, but there's still a lot of negative techniques used with dogs because they're a lot easier to control. But if you remove that ability, are you brave enough to remove that ability that you're saying, I'm no longer controlling it, the dog can choose what it wants to do, is it going to still choose me or is it going to choose something else? And I think that's really where you have that of if you really want to do it for your dog and have that your dog is actually able to really choose and do the right thing. And is it through really the well-being of the animal because of the destroying of the animal spirit through punishment? That's really the question to be taken.
Definitely. I think you can generalize as well from what you've learned in zoos and potentially looking at the language you use to talk to other dog trainers, help them get some small successes, which are going to help them save time, decrease stress.
Yes.
And I don't know.
And it's funny because I have spoken to a lot of dog trainers and they're like, oh, I can't get my dog to do that. And I said, if I can get a giraffe to do it, I'm pretty sure you can get your dog to do it. And it's this type of thing of how you do it. And another one that I've dealt quite a bit with is also horses. There is still a lot of traditional training going on with horses, and that positive reinforcement cannot work with horses because they lose control. And that is really the principle in it, is suddenly this fear of you are releasing that control, because then the animal has to choose to either do this or that, and you're not forcing it to do that. And usually when horses first have that choice, they do get very, very excited because suddenly they get to participate in the decision making. And so then either the trainer or the rider or the owner gets very nervous about what they consider unpredictable behavior, where it's actually just the animal showing its excitement of being able to choose and working through that so that you're able to actually have a relationship that isn't based on strictly dominance.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up. I know there's a lot of horse trainers that listen to this podcast, so great that we've got an opportunity to talk about that. Just before we do move on, if you could just quickly run us through the last organization that you're involved with. There's quite a few, and that is IMATA. What you do with IMATA quickly, and then we'll move to the next question.
Yeah. I've been involved in IMATA for many years. I started back in 1998 as the regional European coordinator, and then I was the vice president and organized the 2004 annual conference in Sweden, Kolmården, Sweden. And then when I was working at a zoo, I kind of stepped back, but now I'm back involved in doing the regional European workshop this year in November that will be at our facility. And then also I'm the regional report coordinator. So I work with all the organizations or facilities in the Northern European area.
And we forgot to tell everyone what the acronym IMATA stands for. So maybe quickly say that and we'll move on.
IMATA is the International Marine Animal Trainers Association. It's basically the oldest animal training organization that's out there. So it's an extremely good resource for anybody. You don't necessarily have to be marine animal oriented.
Yeah, fantastic. And just quickly, I say this numerous times, but this will be the last time. Just quickly, where can people go to find out more about this workshop and about IMATA?
You can go on to imata.org to find out more about IMATA. And then you can also go on to our Facebook page, which is the Animal Training Workshop. And it is on November 26th through 28th. Yes, in Denmark.
Cool. And I'll link to all that stuff in the write-up for this podcast if you wanted to find out more. We'll move on, though, because what I wanted to talk about now was your other current role working with the Marine Animal Behavior and Bioacoustics team. Can you tell everyone listening a little bit about your role here and what this team is?
Well, my role is I'm the leader of the team. And the team consists of me and a group of master's students and international volunteers that all work with 3 male gray seals and 2 great cormorants, as well as very soon some common murres and puffins, and currently also king penguins, to better understand the effects of underwater noise on hearing. And the reason why we have so many birds, marine birds, is because this is a very important interest currently right now, is the effect on birds, since it was just recently discovered that they're actually very good at hearing underwater.
Yeah, and the recent discoveries was from the research that you guys are doing there?
Yeah, it was actually. It was really great is that we were able to train a great cormorant to do an underwater hearing test, where basically it was trained to answer a yes or no question. And so it could answer, yes, I can hear it, or no, I can't. And we determined that they hear a lot better. Theoretically, it had always been thought that they can't hear underwater since they have a strictly terrestrial ear. But we've determined that they actually are, in their frequency of hearing of 1 to 4 kilohertz, can hear just as well as seals and dolphins that are underwater experts, hearing experts.
So how did you set this up that the cormorant it was all voluntary, wasn't it? How did the cormorant say yes or no?
It was, I would probably say this has been the most challenging behavior I've ever had to train. And the way it was set up was the animal was asked to station underwater with its head. They have a long neck, cormorants, with its head through an underwater PVC tube and resting its body on a PVC plate with a speaker in front of its head. And a certain tone or noise would be played. And if it heard the tone, it would back out of the setup and touch its beak on a little red target to say, yes, I did hear it. If it didn't hear it, it would continue to sit in the tube until the trial was over. And that is what we call a go, no-go testing paradigm, where it would go to the response target if it did hear it, and then the no-go would be it would stay, not go, and stay at station if it didn't hear it. And that's how we trained it, but it took a long time.
Yeah, it must be challenging. Would the cormorant ever come out and just go pick the red button to try and earn reinforcement?
Well, and that's where you really need to also have the control trials, where it's just as reinforcing to stay in and say, I don't hear it, as it is to stay, yes, I do hear it. So that there's equal reinforcement, so that the reinforcement payoff and the payoff matrix is exactly the same for a I don't hear it as it is for a I do hear it.
And we discovered a lot about their hearing. We discovered that they can hear more than we thought underwater. And moving forward, what do we take away from this research? What impact does this have for wild birds?
Well, the next step is, and that's what we're starting now, is to determine if they actually can determine direction from their hearing. So if they hear a sound, can they say, okay, the sound is over to my left, or the sound is over to my right, or the sound is behind me? We as humans can hear underwater, but we are not able to determine direction. So we can't use it for anything. So that is what we're in the process of doing now, determining how they use their hearing. And what our goal is actually, which is very exciting, is that we will be training the birds for free flight and training them to go out in the bay that is near us and do these underwater directional hearing tests in an open bay. So that's very exciting. But I think if we look at it, just the short or the effects that this can have is marine mammals and even fish and a lot of marine life are already regulated by the effects of noise underwater. But no one has ever considered birds because it was thought that they didn't hear. According to their hearing frequency, and what we've determined is they're hearing between 1 and 4 kilohertz underwater. And this is exactly this area where man-made noise is. So noise from ships, noise from windmills, any type of other anthropogenic noise that we make is in this frequency range. This can have a huge impact if all the noise that's produced underwater, man-made noise, is actually right in their range where they are determining, is there a fish 10 meters below me? Is there a predator 5 meters behind me? Is the beach to my left? This can have a lot of effects.
And so with this new study, you're going to be sending the birds out into the bay. How are you going to do this? Is it going to be a similar setup?
No, now this is what we're going to do is what we call an alternative choice. So the animal gets to choose. So we will have a underwater speaker array where there'll be a series of speakers and then the animal will swim toward the speaker that is producing the sound.
So it's like an underwater recall, a free flight underwater recall.
Yeah, basically, if you think about it that way, if it's trained to go toward the sound source, right? So you're going to train it, you go toward the sound source and then you get reinforced. So wherever the sound is, reinforce. Wherever the sound is, reinforce. And if they choose wrong, of course, then they don't get reinforced, but then we move on to the next trial. When I started this research, I was very shocked by it as to what I was told how to train it. And in principle, when working with birds, and especially in doing research, the animals are kept at 60 to 70% of their body weight. And so basically then you're dealing with an animal that is really hungry, and you're dealing with an animal that is only doing the task because it's needing food. And then what happens as a consequence is the animal isn't necessarily able to concentrate on the task itself. If we say that the animal has to answer a yes or no, do I hear the sound or do I not? And instead of a go, no go, we have a yes, no, where the animal hits a yes paddle or a no paddle. But you're starving. You're probably just going to start hitting any paddle out of control, right? Because you're just going to want food. So then how do we get the animal under stimulus control in that type of situation? We would have to punish the animal to make sure that it's not hitting the paddle when it's not supposed to be. And that's what I found out. And this is what was really sad for me, was finding out that the majority of all the bird research and hearing research that had been done on birds was based on deprivation and positive punishment. And when I proposed that we would be doing this strictly on positive reinforcement with animals at their healthy weight, and basically our birds, because they live outside and in a semi-Arctic environment, they're fed ad libitum. I was told that I would never be able to get this done, and especially for an underwater audiogram. And I think the reason why we were actually able to achieve the underwater audiogram is exactly because we did exactly that. We gave the animal to choose to participate or not. The animal was healthy, it was not starving, and it was motivated to do the task because it was actually an enriching task to do. And even when we turned in the manuscript for publication, the editors came back and said that they couldn't publish it. One of the comments was, I needed to be able to prove that I had punished the animal to get the data I needed. And when I told them that no punishment was needed, that it was strictly based on positive reinforcement, they still had a hard time believing that we were able to achieve this. That's what's really still shocking to me. So I guess something that I feel very strongly is in the research is, I think a lot of times the animal's real welfare is put on the line to get the data that we need. And that's exactly the problem. Can we really count on this information that we're getting from animals if we are putting them in basically a stress response, so that it's basically responding from stress to determine if it can hear a sound or not if we're doing a hearing test? Or do you have an animal that's really motivated and is in the task saying, okay, do I hear it or do I not? And I think that poses a very ethical question. Again, in the marine mammal world, I have never experienced animals being put through that type of regimen in a research situation because you just don't risk it. The animals are worth too much money. But when you have an animal like a little tiny bird that you can completely manipulate, then for some reason, is it okay that we're doing that?
we won't get into this ethical debate right now. I think
I know. Yeah.
it seems that though that potentially, that's the feedback you're getting about a paper that you want to get published. And I don't know much about this area, but just going from the information you've told me, that research is behind where we are with our understanding and application of behavior science in zoos, dog training, and potentially
Horses.
horses. We're at that stage that the zoos were at maybe 15 years ago.
Yes, I think so. I completely agree. Even also when I've presented at conferences this information and I show them the diagram of how the animal came into the setup, I still have people asking me, so the animal was strapped into the setup? Because they just don't honestly believe that the animal voluntarily swam into it and then was voluntarily participating in the project, which is very interesting to me.
Yeah, seems like we need just another area. We need people like you and to work towards this mind shift that we can do it in more positive ways.
We're trying.
So does this mean that we've done research in the past, we've used deprivation and we've used positive punishment, we've got research results, and then we've gone out and practically applied this information to what we do in the world, potentially impacting legislation and the laws that we had to adhere to? Does this mean that potentially we've been working on incorrect information? If the way we've got to that information is the animals have been behaving out of stress and hunger?
And I think that's exactly the question that I'm asking and trying to be politically correct, of course, is can we really rely on this information and data that we have collected from animals that are actually responding out of a stress response, as opposed to responding and actually answering the question that's at hand?
Very interesting area moving forward. In your role with the marine animal behavior and bioacoustics team, you've done a bit of other research with seals as well, haven't you?
Yeah, we have 3 male gray seals that we also are doing the effects of underwater noise with them, and they're a bit more advanced in their training. So with them, it's very fun because we can add underwater noise, and then you add a tone into the underwater noise, and then test if they can still find that tone. So with this, then you're actually able to directly see how much the underwater noise is affecting them by being able to see if they can still detect the tone within the noise or not.
And have you found any difference in acceptance of research methods when using seals as opposed to birds? So have people been like, oh, cool, you're using a seal. Yeah, you can use positive reinforcement, but not with a cormorant.
We trained this test, actually, it was a master's project with one of the people on the staff where they trained a goldfish to do the same thing. And we also have 2 little turtles in our lab that we're also wanting to do the same thing. Of course, some are quicker to learn than others. And for some, it's an easier task than others. I'd say for the seals, it took about 3 months to learn the task. For the bird, it took about a year. So, I mean, there's, of course, a different learning curve, but they can all learn. I mean, positive reinforcement is a very instinctual thing. You do what pays off better, right? If you get punished for doing something, you're not going to want to do it again because it threatens your survival. If you do something that gives you something nice, you're going to want to do it again. It's a much healthier decision for animals to want to participate in positive reinforcement.
And talking about it being a more healthy decision, one of the other titles of a paper you were involved in is Decrease Stress, Train Your Animals, the effect of handling methods on cortisol levels in harbour porpoises. I find this really interesting. Can you tell us about this, the levels of cortisol and handling methods?
Yeah, this was very interesting. This was actually quite a while ago. This was about 18 years ago, but it was funny because we came into this with training harbour porpoises for the first time. It hadn't really been done before. And a lot of people said that harbour porpoises couldn't be trained. They were too nervous. They were too skittish. And of course, as trainers, we came in and said, oh, of course, they can be trained. And we said, but we have to train them to do, because they are so susceptible to stress situations, we have to train them to participate in all of their medical procedures. And one of the researchers said, well, why? And we said, because that reduces stress. And they said, how do you know that? We said, because we do. I mean, we're the animal behaviorists. We know all of this. And I think that's it. When you're working with an animal every day, you can see the behavioral response. But of course, that isn't proof, right? So what we did was we measured, because these were wild animals that were brought in, and blood was taken every month to monitor their health. During the first few months before we could train for the voluntary blood taking, blood had to be taken by having the animal being taken out of the water and, of course, restrained. When we first started doing this, the animal resisted a lot. It moved a lot when it was on deck, didn't enjoy it. And that goes without saying. So then we tried to keep the same people doing it, the procedure in the same sequence, trying to keep things as predictable as possible so that maybe the animals would kind of in some way habituate to the process. And we did see over the months that they calmed down. Where basically, in the end, the animals would basically just swim into our arms to be taken out to do it. So behaviorally, we saw that the animals seemed to habituate to it. Now, when the animal was finally trained for the voluntary blood, for all of these measurements, we were measuring cortisol levels. And cortisol is a very basic way of being able to test for a stress response in an animal by measuring the cortisol. So we compared the cortisol levels from the times that we took the animals out for blood sampling and the times that we voluntarily took their blood sampling. And what we saw was directly from the very first time we took a voluntary blood sample and all the ones following is that we had a 3-fold decrease in the cortisol level. So we were able to reduce the animal's stress by 3 times by training the animal to voluntarily participate in these behaviors. The other interesting aspect in this project was that even though we saw a behavioral response in the time that we were taking the animal out over the months where they seemed to habituate to the behavior, so then you would think that the cortisol level would go down. The cortisol level in the animal was exactly at the same level as it was the very first time we ever took a blood sample from the animal from the wild. So even though behaviorally the animal indicated that it was calmer, it was actually just learning to deal with the stress, but it wasn't more relaxed. It hadn't habituated in any way. But the voluntary training of the behavior, giving that animal the option to choose whether or not to participate in the behavior, reduced the stress response by 3 times.
That's huge.
It's huge. It's huge.
And how do we move forward with that other interesting finding that you had, that the cortisol levels didn't change with duration of being restrained? I mean, how?
Yeah. And I think that's something that we need to always then remember, is even though that the animal is maybe accepting it, they still knew that they didn't have a choice, right? So the animal may be accepting to do the behavior, but it's not necessarily having the choice. So the stress is still there.
So how do we manage moving forward? It just reminds me of, and this is a secondhand account of a story someone was telling me the other day about a bit of a study done with dogs. And I say a bit of because I think it was done on a television show where dogs were left by themselves and they observed them, and some of the dogs were kind of pacing and looking out the window. Some of the dogs went and lay down in the beds. But what they found was that this wasn't an indication of the cortisol levels of the dogs. And a dog lying in the bed might have as high a cortisol level as a dog that's pacing and looking out the window. So once again, that's more of an anecdote. I don't have the actual reference paper for that. But just thinking about what you've just said and thinking about that example, how do we move forward with this information? What kind of takeaway messages can we get from it?
I mean, I think the takeaway messages, and that's a very good point. What would be super is if in any way you could measure the cortisol level of the animal lying on the bed versus the animal pacing, because there's a very good chance, as we're saying, there's a 50-50 chance that dog has just as high a level of cortisol as the one pacing. So I think for me, I think that's this power of operant conditioning, and where people, even with their best intentions in using operant conditioning, sometimes forget what operant means. And the operant means that it's the operator that is in control. And a lot of times what we think is that the operator is the trainer, but the operator is not the trainer. The operator is the animal. It's the animal that can choose whether or not to participate. In operant conditioning, the animal is the one that chooses what happens. So especially this is the hard thing with dogs that are at home, because they're not able to choose whether or not they're at home or not, right? Because the people have to go to work. But then we want to look at, okay, if they have to go to work, how can we give the animal some kind of choice as to what it would choose to do instead? And I think in some ways, what I've tried to do, and it's not necessarily, I have no idea if it's a good thing, but I also have to go to work every day. And I sometimes can take my dog to work, but sometimes she's at home too. So what I try and do is make her excited for me to leave by providing enrichment toys that all her food is hidden in. So she knows when I leave in the morning is when all these games are going to start. And then hopefully when all those games are done, she's tired and then she's going to sleep. I have no proof if this works or not. But I do know that in the mornings when I have to go, and as soon as I start pulling out all these games and stuff that I'm putting food and little puzzles and things, she has no interest in me whatsoever. She just wants the games. So she's basically like saying, can you leave so I can get on with my games?
So the researchers they ask you the question, how do you know it's going to be less stressful? If you're thinking about employing some of these techniques with your animals at home, how do you know? The takeaway message is we don't, because we don't have techniques at home to measure the cortisol levels in our dogs, unfortunately. Right. But the takeaway message is really, I mean, to look at well, tell me what you think. I'm not saying the takeaway message is, I'm saying my interpretation of it is that to look at these studies and go, well, we have to do everything we can, because if the animal's not stressed and we think they are and we're wrong and we give them all this enrichment, great. I mean, no lose. But if they are stressed and we don't think they are, we don't give them anything, then that's a big loss.
Right. I mean, if the animal isn't stressed and you're giving them enrichment, it's not a loss. You're still enriching the animal's life. So that's fine. But if the animal is stressed and you're like, one of the things that I've spoken with is someone who basically got up in the morning, fed their dog, and then went for a long walk, and then came home and got ready for work and left. And they were asking me for help on how do I deal with an animal that doesn't like being left at home. Because then when I leave, the animal would bark. And to me, it was like they were doing all the events backwards, right? So when you get up, then you're doing all the fun stuff. And then you're basically setting them up for this big punishment of you leaving. All these behaviors. You're going into the shower. You're getting ready. You're putting your clothes on. Because they know that is then going to end up with you walking out the door and leaving for 8 hours. Instead of reversing it and saying, okay, I'm getting up. I'm getting ready. Okay, as soon as she gets ready, we're going to go out and go for a walk. Okay, as soon as she goes for a walk, then we're going to come back and then we're going to get all those toys. And then, right? So we kind of want to reverse the question and say, how do we set the animal up for success and give them the challenge that they need instead of setting them up for failure or stress, I guess.
Yeah, really well put. I've got a ton of other questions, but we're going to move on. And I'm going to invite you now to participate in one of my favorite parts of the podcast show. And this is story time. Kirstin, can you please share with everyone listening 2 or 3 stories from your experience training animals so far and some of the important lessons that these have taught you along the way?
Yes. Well, the first one I think was, of course, the one that I said in the beginning was the first time that I ever saw the animal accept me as kind of being good enough to work with this animal. And this was a dolphin. And that honor of feeling like, okay, I had been approved to be able to work with this animal. And I think then one of the other ones was after working with marine animals for many years to suddenly work with terrestrial animals where you're really right there with the animal. And for me, it was working with a tapir and being challenged with really finding the proper reinforcement and something that really made the animal want to participate. I think with marine animals, it's pretty easy. Fish always works. But suddenly working with a terrestrial animal that I knew really nothing about, a tapir, which is kind of a strange, great, wonderful little animal, not little, actually very large, and finding out that they had just as much to offer, if not more, than all these marine animals, and being challenged with finding out that tactile, for example, was more reinforcing than any kind of food. That to me was a huge breakthrough in my understanding of working with animals. And I think probably the last one was when I actually started working with Siberian tigers and working with an animal where you really had to prove that you were fun to be with, because otherwise they didn't want to waste their time. So then you really had to prove that in some way you were enriching, you were interesting, you were motivating, so that the animal would choose to be with you than to do something else. And I think in all of these cases, it's always been these that have pushed my knowledge of what I knew about animals and made me really test what I could do more and what I could do better.
So the lessons there were about motivation, and that's a huge area, motivation for everyone.
Yeah.
And you said you learned that tactile was more reinforcing than the traditional food reinforcer. So how do you go about, for those listening who might be trying to train an animal right now and saying this animal's unmotivated. Can we just build on this a little bit more? What did you take away from that lesson that you now apply when you're going in to work with an animal and you're thinking about motivation and you're thinking about reinforcers? And what advice can you give to someone out there who is working with an animal and they can't seem to find a reinforcer?
Yeah, I think that is it's really opening your mind and not assuming what you think is reinforcing. Because I've also spoken with a lot of trainers and they're like, but I keep reinforcing them, I keep reinforcing, and this behavior is not getting better. What we need to understand is if something is reinforcing, then it will maintain or increase the frequency of the behavior, right? So then if they're saying, I'm using this as a reinforcer, but it is not maintaining the behavior, then it's not reinforcing. So if you're not improving the animal's motivation, then what you are using as current reinforcers are probably not reinforcers, and you're going to have to try and find something else. Another example I have for that is working with manatees. It took us 4 years to find something that they were willing to work for because they were so specific in the way that they wanted. And it ended up being mussels and cooked potatoes. And never would we ever have thought that a manatee that's what would be the candy for a manatee, right? But again, we learned that from watching what they were. And what we did was when we were feeding the other fish in the aquarium with this mussel meat, the manatees would go to the bottom and just start sucking it up. And then that's how we found out.
So a few takeaways in there. First one is potentially we need to develop our understanding and use of the word reinforcement, would you say?
I think so. I don't know if we need to understand. I think we just need to stop assuming what we think is reinforcing. I think a lot of times people say, well, this is their food, so it's reinforcing. It may be their food, but are they really willing to work for it? You know, I will eat broccoli, but if somebody is giving it to me because they want me to do something, I'm probably going to say no. But if they're willing to give me gummy bears, I'll do a lot more. It's that art of finding what is that secret reinforcer that the animal is really willing to work for. And I think then from that, then it's making sure, because another mistake that happens is making sure that you're removing that from any other aspect of their life so that you're only using it in training. So, for example, with red pandas, I've noticed that a lot of people use carrots and bananas, and that's really great for red pandas. But then what they continue to do is provide them in their normal food during the day. And if you do that, then it also takes away what's special about a training session.
So you defined it there as the art of finding the reinforcers.
Yes.
See, I potentially, you're going to laugh at me here, I potentially would work for broccoli. I love broccoli.
See? Oh my God. Now that is so funny. See, perfect. I mean, I think that's perfect. I think it's perfect that you say that. I had a dog that would work for cucumber, and she would choose cucumber over any other treat. So, I mean, and I think that's exactly it, is that we just make these assumptions, and we need to really make sure that what we are using as reinforcers are truly reinforcers. And then also, can we expand on these reinforcers? Can we, expand on what we're using as not just necessarily primary reinforcers, but conditioned reinforcers? Because this is a lost art, is developing conditioned reinforcers as well. But that's a whole other 2-hour talk.
Maybe we'll get you back for that one.
Yeah.
The art of finding, having numerous reinforcers in your toolbox, and you mentioned observation being key.
Yes.
Once again, with full circle, that's kind of where we started today. Observing your animals and a little bit of trial and error, would you say?
I would say trial and error. I mean, you have to try it, right? And you have to see if it works or not.
So great. Sadly, now though, this does bring us to our final question for this episode. Kirstin, could you please now take us all into the future and share with us what you would like to see happen over the next 5, 10, even longer in the animal training world? 5-10 years, it is.
Wow. I think what I would really like to see is to see that we're training animals in truly an operant conditioning situation, that animals aren't being pressed to do something they don't want to, that there is this choice and control over a situation, and that there also, as we're still fighting this old school, new school situation, is that people are still considering the fact that training is a science and it's scientifically proven to improve the welfare of these animals. And so that it would be accepted as a better way of managing animals in captivity. And really with that, it is really looking at where we currently are, the danger we have in being threatened with having animals in captivity is the power that we have as animal trainers to prove the welfare and well-being of the animals that we have compared to the animals that are also out in nature is through the animal training and how we can prove that the animals are healthy and productive in captivity.
So more science?
More science. We need a lot more science. And we need to be, well, I wouldn't even say, I mean, we have a lot of science, but we need to be more vocal. I think the animal training world is being too passive in this anti-captivity pressure. And we need to be on the forefront showing our knowledge. We know it. We experience it every day. We need, as you say, maybe we do need some more science to prove it, but there is an awful lot of science out there proving it. But we need to be aggressively showing our knowledge.
So we need a voice, kind of like this podcast.
Yes. Yeah.
We need the opposite of Caesar Milan to be on National Geographic.
Exactly. Thank you. I wasn't going to say his name, but you said it.
I think after 43 episodes, I've just breached that. And you just inspired me because you said we need to be more vocal.
We need to be more vocal. We need to stop being passive and standing around the sides. We need to be up there saying this is not okay. This is not okay that someone like Caesar Milan is allowed to show these horrible, aggressive, violent ways of managing animals on international TV. We need to show that what we are doing with animals is better than what PETA is doing with animals. And we need to do it, and we need to be aggressive about it.
Well, thank you for that input, because you helped me say the name after the 43 episodes.
I'm so glad, because I was going to say it earlier, but I thought I'll be okay. But so now you've said it, and now it's out there.
Hey, such a great vision. And obviously we're working really hard, all of us, to make these things transpire as we move forward over the coming years. As mentioned, though, that does sadly bring us to the end. But before we wrap up, from myself and on behalf of everyone listening, Kirstin, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come on the show today. It's really appreciated.
You are so welcome. It was a pleasure.
Fantastic. And of course, we really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And I want to ask a small favor of those listening. If you do enjoy these podcasts, and as a practitioner of best practice behavior management yourself, you feel that the information held within could help others, then please share this wherever you can. Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Pinterest, Snapchat, whatever you use, so that as a community, we can do absolutely everything within our power to disseminate this information as far and as wide as possible. And one really easy way to do this, if you're listening to it from a podcast app on your mobile device or smartphone, is there should be 3 little dots next to the title of this episode. This might change slightly depending on what device you're using, what app you're using. But if you click on the link, there'll be an option to share it, and you can choose your platform that you want to share it on, and it's done. Really simple. Takes you 30 seconds. If you could do that, that would be super. That's it for this episode, though. We will wrap it up there. Thanks again so much for listening. Hasta mañana, iguana. You'll hear from us again soon.